Hello and welcome to episode 26 of the Catholics Against Militarism podcast. This podcast is actually part 2 in a 3-part series. So we started with episode 25, in which Father McCarthy and I talked about an article written by James Martin. And in this episode, we're going to talk about a video that Bishop Barron put out in 2016. It was called Bishop Barron on Daniel Berrigan and Nonviolence. So Bishop Barron gave his thoughts on Daniel Berrigan, a great peace activist in the church, and nonviolence. And so we're going to talk about that. I'm going to play a clip from his video. But if you wanted to, you could go watch the whole video. It's probably less than 10 minutes long. It's not that long. You could go listen to everything he has to say and then come back and listen to this podcast. It might be beneficial. We're not actually going to talk too much about Daniel Berrigan today, but if you're watching on YouTube, the photograph that you see is actually a photograph of Father McCarthy and Daniel Berrigan from back in the day. Charlie said he was about 40 in that picture, so I just thought it was kind of a cool photograph, and I wanted to share that with you. But anyway, we're going to go ahead and proceed with this, and there will be another episode that will be part 3 of the conversation, and that will be episode 27. So here we go. Thanks for tuning in. So I'm just going to play a 2-minute clip from the middle. In the beginning of the video, he talks about Dan Berrigan, and now he's going to answer the question about nonviolence. So I'll play that so you can hear his thoughts, and then we'll talk about that.
Remus, what do you think about nonviolence? And he gave an answer which I'll confess I'd never heard before, and never really heard since, but it's always stayed in my mind as like the best way to approach this thing. He said, the church needs pacifists the way it needs celibates. Interesting thing. In other words, both the pacifist and the celibate witness to the eschaton, to the way we will live in heaven. So, celibacy. Jesus says, in heaven, we will neither marry nor be given in marriage, because we'll be more like angels. We're going to live and love in a way that's not less than marriage, but greater than marriage. So the celibate who eschews marriage here below is witnessing even now to the eschatological fulfillment of human love, right? Now, Cardinal George said, I love celibates. I'm a celibate, but I don't want everybody to be a celibate. If everybody were celibate, the human race would go out of existence, for one thing, you know. So they're there to play a very important witnessing role. In a similar way, he said, people who advocate radical nonviolence have an eschatological witness value. They are living even now the way we will live in heaven. When the lion and lamb will lie down together, we will beat our swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks, when all will live in peaceful harmony. Is it that way now? No, but it will be one day. And so it's good even now to have some people who witness to it dramatically. But then he said, just as I don't want everybody to be celibate, I don't want everybody to be a pacifist. What he had in mind there now was the great Catholic tradition of just war, it seems to me, and the maintenance of justice. Would it be wise for all police officers to be radically nonviolent? I would submit no. Would it be wise for every politician, every political leader to be an advocate of radical nonviolence? I would say no, because when certain fundamental rights are threatened, sometimes in this fallen, sinful world, the only recourse we have is to violence. You know, bring it down to a more local level. Suppose I walked out of this house and...
All right, I think that should be enough.
Yeah.
So let me just tell you my first impression when I heard that, just right off the bat. This was years ago, and I had already become familiar with you, Charlie, and your lectures and teachings. I thought to myself, here's a bishop of the church who's taking his best guess about the whole nonviolence thing. He basically says, one time I heard a guy say this, and it seems to me to be a pretty good answer. Like, he doesn't actually have an answer. He just heard something once that sounded good, and he's like, let's just go with that. And I thought that was right away off the bat. I was like, seriously, you're a bishop and you don't actually have you're just kind of taking your best guess on this stuff? And I have more to say about that, but what did you think about Bishop Barron's idea that, We provide a good eschatological witness value as people who don't want to fight in war.
Well, I think he either should stop saying the Our Father or he should say the Our Father, one or the other. Because right in the Our Father it says, Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And what is the will of the Our Father? What is the will that's being talked about? It's the will of God as revealed by Jesus. And what does the Catechism say sums up the Catechism in section 1970 and section 2822? It says that the entire will of God is summed up, or another passage contained, in Jesus' new commandment, love one another as I have loved you. You see, Ellen, war is a sociological category, an abstraction. The question is, can a Christian do those acts that are required in war, or can he not do them, or she? For example, sticking a dagger in someone's throat, burning someone's face off. And if they can't do them, why can't they do them? And if they can do them, why can they do them? Well, what's taking place here is, with Robert Barron, is that we could ask about everything that Jesus teaches. Why isn't it just eschatological? When Jesus says you shall not commit adultery, when Jesus says love your enemies, anything that Jesus says, when Jesus says don't take oaths, which by the way is his teaching, it's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. That's not the community's teaching. When Jesus says no divorce, why isn't that all just the way things will be in heaven? The answer is, of course, that at the very close of the Sermon on the Mount, the great Magna Carta of the Catholic Church, of all churches, and the ultimate presentation of gospel nonviolence in the gospel, in fact, scholars call it the gospel within the gospel. At the very end, the words are, after chapter 5, 6, and 7, the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, the words are, it is not those who say, Lord, Lord, but those who do the will of the Father. Now, let's be clear. The will of the Father is the will of the Father as revealed by Jesus, not as revealed by Thomas Aquinas, not as revealed by Augustine, not as revealed by me, but as revealed by Jesus. And Jesus says, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, put up the sword. And I could go on, and as I have in my Behold the Lamb retreats, I could go on with this for an hour in how the passages of the New Testament absolutely, positively, unequivocally have Jesus rejecting violence, not only in terms of what he said, but in terms of how the community identifies him, e.g. as the suffering servant of Israel. Now, that being the case, what is Robert Barron doing here? Once again, like James Martin, the church, the institutional church, not the church of the Baptist, the institutional church, the one that has bank accounts, the one that has power, wealth, etc., status. The institutional church is on a project of rehabilitating itself. And how is it going to rehabilitate itself? Because it's becoming clearer and clearer and clearer that Jesus' teachings are teachings of nonviolent love of friends and enemies, and that there's no exception to them, and that this is the teaching. Jesus rejects violence. Jesus rejects enmity, period. That being the case, Ellen, what takes place here is, in the old days, and by the old days I mean when I was growing up, but long, long before that too, for hundreds of years before that. Christians in the West were saying, well, the priests, now this is the priests and the bishops, because most Christians in the West before the 1840s and around there couldn't even read. They got their stuff from the pulpit and what the priests and bishops said. But Christians were taught that you could use violence and you could go to war for Napoleon or for this or that or the other, whatever other hoodlum was running a country at the particular time, and you could kill for them and maim for them and die for them. That you could do all these things because didn't Jesus cleanse the temple and whip those money changers out of there? Didn't Jesus say, I come not to bring peace but the sword? Etc. All those proof text things. Well, in the light of communications, contemporary scholarship, education, learning that is in the Catholic community, etc., it has now become clear, absolutely clear, morally certain, that none of those passages ever were meant to justify violence. I've written extensively on this and talked extensively on it, but the fact of the matter is Catholic bishops, even in their war-peace pastoral, never reached to those passages to justify violence and enmity. Because they were not meant for that. Think about this. In the first 3 centuries of Christianity, there is not one sentence justifying Christians going to war. Not one sentence ever written. And in those 3 centuries, the everyday common language of the church was Greek, not Latin. And the Gospels were written in Greek. And no one ever thought of using those proof texts as a way of justifying violence against the human being, even though the church and individual Christians were under terrible threat of persecution by the Roman Empire during those years. So what takes place here is that they're always looking for a new angle on how to justify the church's violence, how to get around Jesus' teachings of nonviolence, how to keep the church ingratiated to the local militaries, whether it's Germany or France or England or the United States, and therefore keep the church as a recruiting agency for Christians going in doing the will of the local Paul who wants to go to war for some reason.
And so this eschatological interpretation is sort of the most recent way of poo-pooing nonviolence in a way. Like, well, no, you don't really have to. Okay.
Absolutely, Ellen. That's eschatological simply means at the end of time, huh? And when Jesus comes and everything is all, everything is finished. It's over now. But here's the point. Celibacy in the church is a discipline. Jesus' rejection of violence and enmity is right at the heart of the gospel. Take that out. Take his rejection of violence and enmity out by word and deed, and you don't even have a crucifixion that's worth looking at, let alone the other things he said. So, Robert Barron says that he heard this analogy that pacifism was like celibacy, that it was something for the eschatological reign. After we die and go to heaven in the last judgment, then everyone will be pacifist and everyone will be celibate. And in the meantime, pacifism, like celibacy, is just a witness about a future event over the horizon of time and into eternity that will take place. He says himself he had never heard that interpretation before until Cardinal George said it. And the reason he never heard it before until Cardinal George said it is it's stupid. No one ever presented that before. That's not what the gospel is about. That when Jesus says, love your enemies, put up your sword, he who lives by the sword dies by the sword. Pray for those who persecute you, etc., etc., etc. When he takes on the identity of the suffering servant of Israel, that's not to be meant eschatologically. That will have eschatological consequences, but that is meant to be lived here and now.
And it seems to me that, I mean, I'm not delving into the whole priests getting married thing. I don't want to deal with that on this podcast, but it seems to me that Jesus never actually says anything about anything explicit in the gospel about whether priests should be married, but he says so much about violence and put down the sword and don't resist evil with evil and all. I mean, he's always talking about this stuff. So it seems like to equate those two things, where one is very, very clear in the gospel and other is part of the church's teaching or tradition, but not so clear, there's something funny going on there.
Yeah, it's like once again, we don't want to get into the whole issue of married priest, even though
I'm talking to one.
I know you're talking to one, even though, and I don't get into it. I don't care about it one way or another. But even though Jesus has at least 11 of his 12 apostles married, and even makes the first pope married. The thing is that those things are clear. Those things are there, but that's not the issue. The issue is that when Jesus, from the cross itself, where Jesus says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do," to those who have tortured him, murdered him, destroying his life, destroying his mission, destroying everything, he is revealing the will of God for humanity to live in this world. And he is revealing it under the worst of conditions. And how does he know the will of God? Because he's God. The Word became flesh. Now, when some bishop or some priest or some layman says, "Jesus, you don't know what you're talking about," that's dangerous ground to be on. That is dangerous ground to be on. And you know, there's the old saying, you know, that the road to hell is paved with mitres, meaning bishops' hats, you know.
Mm.
And that saying is there, and that's not new. That's hundreds and hundreds of years old. And that saying is there because there is such an extraordinary dissonance between what Jesus was and said and did, all of which are in harmony with each other in terms of truth, his words and his deeds, and the church teaching salvation through the just war theory. There's a danger here that's more than accommodating world governments of the world. You're playing with the salvation of the immortal souls of people, and you are in your own immortal soul, and you're telling them that while Jesus says salvation comes through me, and salvation and that doing the will of God is doing what I say is the will of God, and doing his will on earth as it's done in heaven is loving as I have loved, and this is a commandment, not just a good idea by Jesus. And you're bypassing all that and saying, well, Cicero worked out a just war theory a few decades before Jesus, and now we're going to adopt that, and salvation comes through Cicero's just war theory. I'm telling you, I know how the arguments go back and forth, and I know them in detail between just war theory and this and that and the other thing and various forms of it. But this is toying with eternal salvation, not only of the bishops, but of people. How many times do we have to see? Hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, just in our own society and modern world, human beings come home from war and have their souls and spirits and hearts and minds just devastated with misery and evil and despair and death and suffering. They're toying. They're toying.
Yeah, and there's no way to measure the amount of damage that's done. I remember hearing once there was a documentary I watched, and we're talking about the fatherlessness in society, and the fact that children need a father in the home, and so many children in our society grow up without a father. And a lot of people say that this stems from the welfare state, that the government stepped in and started taking the role of the father. And so we had this phenomenon of more and more single mothers. But they said, actually, that's not true, that the fatherlessness epidemic in our society goes back to the World War I and World War II, when the fathers were killed by the millions in these wars. And you have all these children that grow up without their father, or if their father does come home, they come home shell-shocked, PTSD, alcoholic, whatever the case may be, and that those children are growing up with a father in the home, but they're not really there. And so you just can never measure the ripples that go out from this evil, and which kind of I don't know if we're done with the video yet, but that kind of transitions into a thought I had about Father Barron's article on 1917. But did you have anything more to say about the clip about celibacy and nonviolence?
Yeah, I think that I think that Robert Barron, first of all, should educate himself in terms of the theology, spirituality, and history of gospel nonviolence, and not like bishops and priests and Christians educate themselves in terms of heresies. That is they're presented the heresy as if these are stupid people that don't know what they're talking about, and therefore instantly dismiss it. The comparison that he and Cardinal George make is between celibacy and pacifism. Ellen, as I've said before and I've told you, I am not a pacifist. Pacifism, the word enters the word enters language in the French dictionary for the first time in the 1880s. The first time it appears in English, pacifism or pacifist, is in 1910 in the Oxford English Dictionary. Pacifism is the rejection of war. You can be a pacifist for all kinds of reasons. Because you're a Christian, you can be an atheist and be a pacifist. But it is the rejection of the phenomena of war. Jesus' teaching is about love, the kind of love that is divine love, and his teaching is clear. Divine love is devoid of enmity and violence. Devoid of enmity, and there is no violence in God. That's the teaching of the church. There is no violence in God. Therefore, the Christian is not a pacifist. He is someone committed to loving as Christ loved, and he knows as sure as the hand in front of him, you can't love as Christ loved and do the trillion of acts that war requires of you to do. From cheating, lying, killing, maiming, torturing. You can't do it. It's impossible. Equating Christian nonviolent love of friends and enemies that Jesus teaches with pacifism is a detour. It's a way of avoiding the problem. It's not about rejecting war. War is a piece of what is rejected because there's no act of war that you can do that is loving as Christ loved. But the issue is to love as Christ loved, whether you're at the grocery store or whether you're wherever you are, not just war. It's just the word pacifism against, as used in terms of Christianity, is a straw man to get Christians to say, oh, well, you can't do that because if you do that, the world is going to be overrun with Hitler, No, the world is not going to, the Christian can do nothing better for humanity, for his or her society, for his or herself, and for God than to follow the teaching of Jesus. If that means the Christian dies before he or she thinks they should die, but they die loving as Jesus loved, they have done the maximum to serve God, the world, the country, and everything they love.
Yeah, and I guess I'll just make one more comment on when you said there's no violence in God. I have a feeling that a lot of people will immediately bring up the Old Testament in their minds as they're kind of thinking through these things. And Charlie has a really good answer to the question, what about violence in the Old Testament? And you can find that answer on a playlist on my YouTube channel called Top 10 Question and Answers About Nonviolence. So if you're thinking that God is violent because there's violence in the Old Testament, maybe check that out. And the other thing that Father Barron brought up, in some ways his video is rather honest because he even admits, I wouldn't want everybody to be nonviolent because, he proposes that it would be dangerous actually for everyone to provide this eschatological witness. And if you think about it, it doesn't make sense that following Jesus would be dangerous. But he says, I wouldn't want everybody to be that way. Would you want your policemen to be nonviolent? Would you be, he brings up the police and things like that. And I found your talk, Charlie, this is also under question and answers on nonviolence on the playlist, your talk where you answered the question, what about the military and the police? Like, can a Christian be in those vocations or jobs? And you bring up the point. See, it seems to me that Robert Barron is trying to cover too much territory. He's trying to come up with the question of, should all people be nonviolent? And I think you do a really good job in that talk, Charlie, of making clear that we're just talking about Christians here, right? Like, to say
absolutely, I don't have anything. No, the first, everything depends upon the question that Jesus asked Peter. Who do you say I am? If you answer that question, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, the Word of God, etc., everything falls into place because God does not lie. He does not tell untruth, and he only knows the way to salvation to conquer evil and death. If you say to that question, who do you say I am? And you say, well, you're a holy rabbi. You're really a smart man. You're someone that got too much sun out in the Middle East. Fine, that's an answer. But you don't have to. If those are the answers, then Jesus is just a guy like us that pulls his pants on one leg at a time and puts his toga on over his head, and that's it. That we don't have to follow him any more than we have to follow anyone else. We just weigh what he says. But when God says, love your enemies, if it's God, and he says, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, pray for those who persecute you. And he says, it's not those who say, Lord, Lord, but those who do the will of the Father, which I've just said. Well, by golly, that's at a different level altogether, because the creature is infinitely separated from God in terms of his awareness of reality, and therefore what conquers evil and death, what is good and what is holy.
Yeah, and I just think that he's overreaching a bit when he starts to talk about like the whole society. The Catholic Church's job isn't to convert everyone to nonviolence and abolish the police force. It's just like, let's just start with having Christians follow Christ. Like, let's just worry about that. I don't know. It just seems to me like he goes off track by bringing in those bigger questions about whether we would want our policemen to be nonviolent. Like, that's not the issue.
No, it isn't. What is the issue is, if, as was the case in England until a couple of decades ago, if all the police were unarmed, all English police were unarmed at one point, and for a long, long period of time until relatively recently, well, then there's a question of, can a Christian be a policeman? But the minute you put that 45 in your holster and you're willing to use it to kill people, to harm people, well, now the question becomes, how do you put a bullet through someone's head and follow Jesus? So the question is not whether you can be a policeman or not. The question is, how do you follow Jesus in that vocation? So let's be clear. There are multiple, hundreds, thousands of vocations, occupations that are there that the Christian cannot enter into, like being the madam of a house of prostitution. But what about killing people on orders of a sergeant? Can you follow Jesus doing that? Ellen, the gospel is about following Jesus, and Jesus puts out what it means to follow him. Now, that being the case, all the other stuff about how would the world work if we had no armies? Well, maybe it will work pretty well, but that's not what the issue here is. The issue here is for the Christian. Should he be part of that process? Which, by the way, is a cyclical process that has led us right to where we are today. War, followed by violence, followed by war. And Jesus comes along to break that cyclical process. He chooses us as disciples because he wants us to participate in that process here on earth, not just in heaven, to break that for the good of humanity. And the fact of the matter is, as it turns out right now, the institutional church is, for all practical purposes in the last 1700 years, indistinguishable from how the rest of humanity deals with the problem of violence and enmity.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, I think we're good. Do we still have it in us to go over his World War I 1917 article?
Oh, I do. Sure.
Okay.
Go ahead. I did. It's a thing is a mess, you know.
Hi, folks. We're going to conclude episode 26 there. So that will conclude our conversation about the video of Father Barron's, where he talks about nonviolence. And in the next episode, we're going to continue the conversation. So that'll be episode 27. And we're going to talk about Father Barron's article on the movie 1917 called 1917 and Remembering Who We Are. So if you enjoyed this conversation, you can tune in for that, for some more conversation about Father Barron. Thank you for listening, and God bless.